Stop scrolling, because if even half of what's being whispered behind closed Bravo doors is true, then this isn't just another messy reality TV fallout. This is a carefully staged collapse hiding in plain sight. What if Kenya Moore didn't just suspect betrayal, but uncovered something that felt calculated? Not emotional, not accidental, but range. Because here's where things get uncomfortable. Marc Daly's stories? They've shifted. Kandi Burruss's denials? Clean but strangely incomplete. And Kenya? She didn't cry on camera. She didn't go live. She didn't expose receipts. She went silent, and silence, in reality television, is never weakness, it's strategy. So ask yourself this. Why do edited scenes suddenly disappear? Why do private messages get misunderstood only after timelines are questioned? And why does nobody actually say, clearly, this never happened? Instead, we get pauses, redirects, repositioning. Tonight, we're not chasing documents because none exist. We're following behavior, patterns, and the kind of quiet withdrawal that usually happens when someone realizes the game was rigged long before they sat at the table. Is this paranoia or perception? Because if Kenya Moore truly saw an arrangement forming one that benefited everyone but her, then what you're watching now isn't heartbreak. It's recalculation. And trust me, this story is just getting started. Kenya Moore didn't wake up one morning and decide to be suspicious. This wasn't a jealous spiral or a dramatic overreaction for camera time. What started raising eyebrows was how quietly everything shifted around her, how conversations stopped making sense, how timelines no longer aligned, how people who once spoke freely suddenly chose their words like they were signing NDA letters in their heads. In the world she lives in, chaos is loud. Arguments are loud. Betrayal usually announces itself with shouting, tears, and explosive confessionals. But this time it arrived wrapped in politeness, distance, and a strange sense of coordination that felt anything but organic. Marc Daly had always been unpredictable. But unpredictability still has patterns. Kenya knew his moods, his silences, his tells. What she didn't recognize was the new version of him, measured, almost rehearsed, as if every response had been pre-approved by an invisible committee. He wasn't defensive enough to be guilty, not confused enough to be innocent. He was calm in a way that didn't belong to a man caught off guard. And then there was Kandi Burruss, someone Kenya had known long enough to understand her rhythms too. Kandi didn't panic. She didn't over-explain. She didn't even deny forcefully. She simply redirected, changed subjects, smiled, kept things moving. That's when Kenya stopped reacting emotionally and started observing strategically, because here's the thing people forget about. Kenya Moore, she may be emotional on camera, but she is not careless off it. She understands production. She understands narratives. She understands when something is being shaped without her consent. And slowly, she began to feel like two people she trusted were moving in sync in ways that had nothing to do with friendship or coincidence. Not romantically, not openly, but operationally. Like decisions were being made elsewhere, and she was being informed after the fact. Nothing illegal. Nothing official. No paperwork to leak. Just alignment. Scenes that once included her perspective were suddenly shortened. Conversations she remembered clearly felt edited down to fragments. Moments that should have sparked follow-up questions were smoothed over in post-production like they never mattered. And every time Kenya tried to revisit something just to clarify, just to understand, the response was the same: confusion mixed with calm dismissal. As if she was the only one who remembered the original version of events. People watching from the outside called it paranoia. They always do. But paranoia usually looks frantic. This didn't. This looked like someone stepping back, reassessing, and quietly counting exits. What really unsettled her wasn't any single incident, it was the repetition. A private message referenced vaguely, but never shown. A meeting that happened briefly, but seemed to have long-lasting consequences. Decisions about appearances, timing, and communication that no one could quite explain. Yet, everyone seemed oddly comfortable with. Kenya started noticing how often Marc and Kandi's explanations overlap without directly referencing each other. Same language, same framing, same emphasis on how everything was being misunderstood. Misunderstood by whom? Certainly not by Kenya. She didn't confront them the way people expected. No explosive dinner scene. No dramatic accusation. Because confrontations only work when the other side is unprepared. This side was ready. Instead, Kenya did something far more unsettling. She went quiet. She stopped sharing. She stopped correcting narratives in real time. She let people assume she was hurt, bitter, or spiraling. And while the public speculated, she watched how quickly conversations shut down when she entered the room. She watched how often her name was mentioned without her being present. She watched how carefully people avoided confirming or denying specifics. And she watched how the story being told publicly didn't match the one she had lived privately. That disconnect was the final confirmation for her, not that something romantic or scandalous had happened, but that something strategic had in reality television. Alliances aren't always about affection. Sometimes they're about leverage, about positioning, about ensuring certain outcomes remain controlled. Kenya began to suspect that whatever understanding existed between Marc and Kandi wasn't emotional, it was practical, mutually beneficial, clean enough to deny, subtle enough to execute, and quiet enough to avoid scrutiny. And the most telling part? No one ever sat her down and said clearly, directly, nothing is happening. Nothing has ever happened. You're wrong. They said everything except that. They said things like, you're reading too much into it. They said, that's not how it was meant. They said, you don't have the full picture. But no one offered the full picture either. So Kenya began to redraw her own. She repositioned herself publicly without explanation. She limited access. She chose silence over spectacle, and in doing so, she flipped the narrative from emotional victim to unreadable variable. Suddenly, she wasn't chasing answers, she was becoming the unanswered question. And that unsettled people far more than tears ever could, because when someone who usually reacts stops reacting, it forces everyone else to fill the silence with their own guilt, fear, or assumptions. And the assumptions started spreading fast. Fans noticed the tension. Comment sections lit up with theories. Old clips resurfaced with new interpretations. Casual interactions were reanalyzed frame by frame. Not because Kenya asked for it, but because the absence of clarity invites investigation. Still, no documents surfaced. No receipts dropped. No smoking gun appeared. Just patterns of alignment. Patterns of avoidance. Patterns of stories that changed just enough to stay technically consistent while emotionally hollow. Kenya didn't need proof to understand what had happened. She needed confirmation, and confirmation came in the form of behavior that no longer made sense unless viewed through a different lens. A lens where loyalty had been replaced by convenience and transparency by coordination. By the time the public started asking questions, Kenya had already moved on mentally. Not healed, strategized. She understood that whatever this arrangement was, exposing it outright would only benefit the people who designed it. Silence, on the other hand, forced them to keep maintaining it, explaining it. Protecting it and maintaining something that doesn't officially exist is exhausting. So while everyone waited for Kenya to break down on camera, she did something else entirely. She stepped back, recalibrated her image, and allowed the narrative to unravel under its own contradictions. Because when a story is built on half answers and mutual deflection, it doesn't need to be attacked. It collapses on its own. And right where that realization settles in, right where Kenya stops trying to be heard and starts choosing when to be seen, is exactly where the next phase of this story begins, without pause, without reset, and without giving anyone the comfort of knowing what she knows next. And that next phase didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived disguised as normalcy. Kenya noticed how quickly everyone wanted to move on, how insistently the conversation was steered toward fresh starts and new chapters, as if closure could be scheduled and confusion could be edited out. But what lingered beneath the surface wasn't resolution, it was pressure. Pressure to accept explanations that explain nothing. Pressure to perform peace for an audience that never saw the negotiations happening off camera. What Kenya found most revealing wasn't what was said, but what was never addressed. When she stopped asking questions, people volunteered fewer answers. When she stopped correcting details, the details became slippery. Timelines blurred. Statements softened. Words like miscommunication and assumptions replaced specifics. It was as if clarity itself had become inconvenient. And that's when Kenya realized the situation wasn't about convincing her anymore. It was about maintaining a version of events that required collective discipline. The discipline showed up everywhere. In how conversations were rerouted mid-sentence. In how certain topics triggered sudden humor, as if laughter could dissolve suspicion. In how carefully everyone avoided naming moments that Kenya distinctly remembered. She began to feel like the only person watching a rehearsal no one admitted was happening. And the more polished the performances became, the more obvious the coordination felt. There were whispers, of course. Anonymous voices who claimed to have seen messages without screenshots. Studio staff who hinted at sensitive overlaps without dates. Friends of friends who described meetings that were purely logistical yet somehow emotionally charged. None of it rose to the level of proof. All of it pointed in the same direction. And in a world built on exposure, the lack of exposure was the loudest clue of all. Kenya didn't chase the whispers. She cataloged them. She noticed which stories traveled fast and which were quietly contained. She noticed who benefited when the narrative stayed vague. She noticed how often her reactions were anticipated and preempted, like moves on a chessboard she hadn't agreed to play on. And she noticed something else to how calm everyone seemed as long as she stayed unpredictable. Publicly, reactions split along familiar lines. Some fans dismissed the tension as ego clashes and old grudges. Others leaned in, dissecting micro-expressions and pauses with forensic enthusiasm. Clips went viral not because they showed anything definitive, but because they showed hesitation, half smiles, delayed responses, eyes that didn't match the words. The audience sensed what Kenya sensed, something unresolved pretending to be settled. Imaginary insiders fed the fire without lighting a match. One claimed there was a mutual understanding designed to keep certain storylines intact. Another suggested that aligning narratives wasn't about friendship at all, it was about leverage during a volatile period. A third insisted nothing improper happened, which somehow raised more questions than answers. Because when denials arrive prepackaged and uniform, they stop sounding spontaneous. Then there was the money talk. Not numbers, not ledgers, just vibes. Lavish dinners framed as business. Travel framed as coincidence. Opportunities framed as timing. Kenya didn't accuse anyone of corruption. She didn't need to. The optics spoke for themselves. When comfort appears to flow in one direction while discomfort concentrates in another, people notice. And Kenya noticed long before the comment sections did. What made the situation combustible wasn't scandal, it was imbalance. An arrangement, if it existed at all, didn't need contracts. It needed alignment. It needed people to keep choosing the same exits and avoiding the same doors. And once Kenya saw that pattern, she understood why confrontation would be useless. You can argue facts, but you can't argue coordination without forcing everyone to admit the choreography. So she let the choreography continue. She watched how interviews leaned on ambiguity. She watched how statements emphasized unity while dodging substance. She watched how her own silence was reframed as sulking, then as strength, then as irrelevance, anything to avoid acknowledging that silence can be a tactic. And with every reframing, the story grew more fragile because fragile stories require constant maintenance. Behind the scenes, Kenya recalibrated. She protected her access. She narrowed her circle. She chose when to appear and when to disappear. She stopped offering emotional labor to people who seemed invested in managing outcomes. This wasn't withdrawal, it was repositioning. A reminder that visibility is currency, and withholding it can be power. The public backlash didn't explode. It simmered. Questions piled up without answers. Fans demanded clarity that never came. Hypothetical investigations were floated in hushed tones, nothing formal, nothing actionable, just the idea that if anyone ever pulled a thread, the sweater would unravel. The mere possibility created tension, and tension in this ecosystem is fuel. Kenya felt the pressure differently, not as fear, but as confirmation. The more people insisted there was nothing to see, the more effort they spent insisting. The more they insisted, the more they revealed how much depended on maintaining the insistence. It became clear that whatever understanding existed, real or perceived, functioned best in the dark. And Kenya had no intention of turning on the lights if doing so meant becoming collateral damage. Instead, she let consequences accumulate quietly. Relationships cooled. Invitations changed. Opportunities shifted. None of it dramatic enough to headline. All of it significant enough to signal that lines had been redrawn. The fallout wasn't explosive, it was structural. And structures don't crumble all at once. They settle, crack, and then suddenly fail. By now, the audience could feel it. The story had moved beyond personalities into patterns, beyond accusations into atmospheres. Kenya wasn't asking for sympathy. She was daring people to notice how denials lacked edges, to notice how narratives circled without landing, to notice how the loudest thing in the room was what no one would say out loud. And as the speculation intensified, so did the stakes. Because silence, once interpreted as weakness, had become a provocation. It suggested that Kenya knew something worth protecting, or that she understood something worth waiting on. Either way, it kept everyone else guessing, and guessing is exhausting when you're guarding a story that can't be fully told. So when talk turned to consequences, legal, reputational, financial, Kenya didn't amplify it. She didn't need to. The mere suggestion was enough to rattle the careful calm. Hypothetical probes, imagined resignations, speculative shifts in alliances all floated into the discourse without her fingerprints on them. The narrative was doing the work for her. By the time people realized that nothing was actually over, it was too late to reset. The story had momentum, and momentum doesn't ask permission. Kenya had stepped into a role she never auditioned for, the variable no one could control. And as long as she stayed unreadable, the arrangement, whatever it truly was, would remain under strain. That strain tightened quietly, steadily, carrying the story forward without a cut, without a break, and without relief, straight into the next stretch where denials harden, patience thins, and the cost of maintaining silence begins to outweigh the comfort it once provided. And that's when the silence stopped being neutral and started becoming expensive. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in the slow accumulation of pressure that builds when too many people are trying to remember which version of the story they're supposed to tell. Kenya could feel it in the air, responses arriving a second too late, statements padded with unnecessary qualifiers, smiles that landed before the explanation did. The choreography was still there, but the timing was off. And when timing slips, coordination starts to show. What followed wasn't a revelation. It was erosion. The kind that happens when maintaining a narrative requires constant recalibration. One small clarification contradicted an earlier soft denial. A casual aside reopened a question everyone thought had been closed. Each attempt to smooth things over introduced a new edge. Kenya didn't push. She didn't need to. The work was happening without her. All she had to do was remain consistent, which, ironically, made her the most stable presence in a story defined by adjustment. Speculation escalated in predictable ways. Imaginary experts weighed in. Anonymous insiders hinted at risk management conversations and brand protection priorities. None of it accused anyone of crimes. It didn't need to. The insinuation was structural, not criminal. This wasn't about wrongdoing, it was about alignment. About who benefited when ambiguity lingered and who paid the price for clarity. The more the conversation drifted into hypotheticals, the more it exposed an uncomfortable truth. If nothing improper happened, why did so many explanations feel defensive? Kenya noticed another shift to the public's patience. At first, viewers wanted answers. Then, they wanted accountability. Finally, they wanted coherence. And coherence never arrived. The story looped, reframed, reset, and looped again. That's when fatigue set in. Not boredom, skepticism. The kind that doesn't shout, but withdraws. The kind that changes how people interpret everything that comes after. Kenya understood that moment intimately. Skepticism is the point of no return. Behind the scenes, consequences began to stack quietly. Partnerships became cautious. Appearances felt transactional. Language hardened into policy speak. People started talking about moving forward with the nervous energy of those who know the ground has shifted but can't admit why. Kenya watched it all with a measured distance. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't vindicated. She was prepared because if there was one thing she learned, it was this: you don't win by exposing a structure built on silence. You let it overextend itself. You let it require more maintenance than it can afford. You let every participant feel the weight of keeping the same story straight. And when that weight becomes heavier than the benefit, the structure doesn't explode. It loosens. People disengage. Priorities change. The alignment dissolves. The irony wasn't lost on her. For so long, her reactions had been treated as the problem. Too emotional, too reactive, too loud. And now, the absence of reaction was the most destabilizing force in the room. It forced everyone else to carry the emotional labor of reassurance. It forced them to perform certainty without the relief of resolution. Kenya had become the calm center of a storm she didn't start and refused to steer. As talk of consequences intensified, it remained safely hypothetical. Imagine reviews, potential reputational recalibrations, whispered concerns about sustainability. Nothing formal, nothing actionable, just enough to keep nerves frayed. Kenya never confirmed or denied any of it. Her restraint made every rumor feel self-generated, which made them harder to contain. When speculation doesn't have a single source, it has infinite ones. Eventually, the question stopped being what happened and became, why does this still feel unfinished? That's a dangerous place for any narrative to live. Unfinished stories invite reinterpretation. They invite revision. They invite the audience to participate. And participation is unpredictable. Kenya understood that better than anyone. She had lived inside audience participation for years. She knew when to speak and when to let the crowd do the work. Her repositioning became obvious only in hindsight. New boundaries, clearer terms, fewer concessions. She didn't announce any of it. She embodied it. And that embodiment recalibrated how people interacted with her. The power dynamic shifted not dramatically, but decisively. When someone stops negotiating their reality, others are forced to adjust. The supposed arrangement, whether real or perceived, lost its oxygen. Not because it was exposed, but because it could no longer rely on her participation. Coordination requires consent, even passive consent. Kenya withdrew hers. And without it, the alignment that once seemed seamless began to fray at the edges. Small disagreements surfaced. Inconsistencies were no longer smoothed over with the same confidence. The maintenance costs rose. By then, the audience had changed too. They weren't waiting for a bombshell. They were watching a slow unwind. They noticed how often the conversation returned to optics instead of substance. They noticed how frequently certainty was asserted without evidence. They noticed how the loudest denials were paired with the vaguest explanations. And they noticed how Kenya, once framed as the emotional variable, had become the quiet constant. There was no triumphant ending, no cathartic reveal. That was the point. The collapse wasn't cinematic. It was administrative. It happened in choices, distances, and recalibrations. In the decision not to correct a rumor, in the refusal to perform closure, in the understanding that some truths are more powerful when they remain implied. Kenya didn't need vindication. She needed autonomy, and she reclaimed it without permission. By the time people realized the story had shifted from scandal to structure, from gossip to pattern, the opportunity to control it had passed. The narrative was no longer owned by any single voice. It belonged to the gaps, the pauses, the contradictions, and the silence that made them impossible to ignore. In the end, what lingered wasn't proof of an agreement or evidence of betrayal. It was a lesson in how power operates when it's understated, how alignment can be felt without being seen, how silence can function as both shield and spotlight. Kenya Moore didn't break down in the way people expected. She broke the expectation itself. And in doing so, she turned a story built on coordination into one defined by uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. It demands attention. It refuses closure. And as long as it remains unresolved, it continues to reshape how every past moment is understood and every future move is interpreted. That's the real fallout, not legal, not financial, not explosive, structural, enduring, and impossible to fully undo, because once a narrative reveals that it can't survive clarity, it never truly recovers. It just adapts, quieter and more cautious than before, while the person who refused to play along moves forward in chasing answers, unburdened by explanations, and fully aware that sometimes the most powerful exposure is simply letting people notice what no one is willing to say. So now, the question isn't whether this story is true or false. The real question is why it still feels unfinished. Why does every explanation sound rehearsed? Why does every denial leave space for doubt? And why does Kenya Moore's silence feel louder than any statement ever released? If nothing happened, why does so much effort go into proving that nothing happened? This is where you come in. Because stories like this don't live or die in official statements, they live in patterns, in behavior, and in what people choose not to address. Do you think Kenya saw something others wanted buried? Do you believe silence can be a strategy, not a weakness? Or is this just another example of reality TV blurring the line between narrative control and real-life consequences? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation doesn't end when the camera cuts. And if you notice details others miss, pauses, contradictions, moments that didn't sit right, say it out loud. That's how these stories stay alive. Make sure you like this video if you felt the tension. Subscribe if you want more deep dives that don't stop at the surface. And turn on notifications, because this story isn't as closed as some people want you to believe. Sometimes the real truth doesn't explode, it lingers. And we're just getting started.